Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletop product review. This time, well, it's for one that I've had on my shelf for a while now. To be honest, I kind of put this one off so long that I almost decided not to cover it at all. However, after double checking that it is in fact still available somewhere, and the recent success of a Kickstarter for reprints, or at least recent as of this recording, I figured I may as well cover it. Dungeon Fantasy Role-Playing Game from Steve Jackson Games is a dungeon crawling focused role-playing game based in a streamlined version of GURPS 4th edition, suitable for the genre, and infused with some of the humor and atmosphere of another Steve Jackson game. Dungeon Fantasy Role-Playing Game is available in a box set and a PDF. As I have the box set and not the PDF, this review will focus on the physical print version. However, it is my understanding that the PDF set consists of 7 PDFs in a single archive. The box set at least comes in a nice, sturdy, full-color box suitable for storage and display as necessary. Inside, the set comes with 2 large playmaps for the included introductory dungeon adventure, 5 softcover, full-color books, 4 of which cover character creation and the rules of the game, and 1 of which is the aforementioned introductory adventure. There are also 4 sheets of cardboard counters for use as tokens during play, associated plastic stands, and 3 D6s, branded with a Steve Jackson Games logo. Pretty much everything you need to play and run the game right out of the box, except maybe some character sheets. The books all follow a similar sort of format. Each book has a full-color, glossy interior with 2 columns of text with the occasional sidebars ranging from half, 3/4, or full width, and then occasionally dotted with artwork, in-character quotes relevant to the topic at hand, and diagrams. The text is clearly broken up by easy-to-read section headings, and the chapters of each book have a color-coded heading and footer. Now, due to the nature of the multi-book layout, I'll cover the contents briefly, starting with the Adventurer's book that covers character creation and such, then Exploits that covers the rules of the game, then Spells, which goes into the various spellcasting skills, and then Monsters book, which is just a sample bestiary. Finally, I'll touch on the included adventure I Smell a Rat. The first book, Adventurers, is broken down into an introduction, 7 chapters, basics, professions, races, advantages, disadvantages, skills, and then cash and gear, plus an appendix. The introduction is a pretty standard explanation of general role-playing, plus the theme of Dungeon Fantasy RPG, which is that of a fantasy role-playing game with a focus on dungeon crawls. Surprise, surprise. Although in many instances it does veer into the beer and pretzel style hack-and-slash feel of things. It includes a glossary of terms specific to the Dungeon Fantasy RPG and general to all RPGs, plus a few focused on the setting itself. There's the usual explanation of dice nomenclature, but like GURPS itself, Dungeon Fantasy RPG only uses various D6s. Thus, the dice nomenclature does away with the sides of the die, simply rendering it as 3D rather than the more typical 3D6. The basic chapter begins to define the basics of character traits. Dungeon Fantasy is a point-based system where each character has a certain number of points to spend to buy ability scores, skills, advantages, and disadvantages, and so on. Characters of Dungeon Fantasy all start with the same point budget, including those gained from taking disadvantages. Aside from point values, all characters have the same set of basic attributes: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and health. A number of secondary characteristics are also derived from these, including base damage for thrusting and swinging, basic lift, which governs encumbrance, hit points, will, perception, fatigue points, basic speed, basic move that covers various movement rates, and size modifier, although size modifier is more based on the character's race than any sort of combination of other attributes. Chapter 2 is Professions. Now, GURPS, the system which serves as a basis for Dungeon Fantasy, is a classless system. Ordinarily, you can just assemble any character that you feel like playing simply by spending the points on various skills, advantages, and so forth. And Dungeon Fantasy can be played that way. But the default assumption is that each character will pick a profession, which is essentially a menu-style template, providing a list of options useful for that particular character type. Each individual profession has some points already pre-spent, but also some options. For instance, each profession has points spent in attributes and characteristics already, as well as some advantages already selected, but then has a certain number of discretionary points available to spend a la carte amongst a menu of additional advantages. The same goes for disadvantages as well as skills, although skills often have packages of pre-selected skills ready to go for different builds. Each profession also has specific advantages that either only they can select or that are most common for that profession. In that case, the advantages in question are listed in that profession's section rather than the advantages section later on. The various professions available are Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, holy warrior, knight, martial artist, scout, swashbuckler, thief, and wizard. Chapter 3 covers races. Like the professions, each consists of a template of pre-selected attribute mods, advantages, disadvantages, and occasionally non-trait features. Unlike professions, these templates don't usually have variations. All dwarves, for instance, have the same selection of abilities, although some may be purchased to higher levels at a later date. Each of these races has a racial cost based on the sum of the base cost of everything they have, and must be purchased from the general other budget of the discretionary points in that particular profession's advantages. So, for instance, dwarves have a racial cost of 20. Knights have 60 discretionary points of advantages, so to play a dwarven knight, you just spend 20 of those 60 points on the dwarf template. The available races are catfolk, dwarf, elf, half-elf, gnome, half-ogre, half-orc, and halfling. There are humans, but they're not considered their own racial template. Chapter 4 covers advantages. Now, advantages in GURPS are the primary means of granting character abilities, beyond skills, of course. They have a point cost and may grant a variety of effects, from special abilities and powers to simply modifications to dice rolls or other various rules. Some advantages may have different levels, some with a linear advancement, such as Born Entertainer, and some with a more dramatic point cost. At this point in the book, many advantages have already been covered, those specific to a particular profession or a particular race. These advantages in the advantages section are mostly those available to multiple professions. As you adventure, your character will acquire more character points, and these may be used sometimes to acquire new advantages or to improve ones that are already purchased. The next chapter, 5, covers disadvantages. These are much like advantages, except that taking them grants points instead of costing points, and they generally penalize the character in some way. There's some discussion of self-control rolls here because a number of disadvantages are actually psychological in nature. Self-control rolls of various difficulties are necessary whenever a character is exposed to something that trigger that disadvantage. And interestingly enough, if a character gains a disadvantage during play, say to an injury, they may in fact get points for it, or at least their point total reduced, at least until the injury is healed or the disadvantage removed somehow. Chapter 6 is skills, which are, like many games, what a character is skilled in. This can be anything from combat skills to non-combat skills to individual spells, although I do note that spells are covered in the spells book, which is a separate book. Each skill is based on an attribute, has a difficulty that tells how that ability is modified for the test, and may have defaults or other skills, sometimes modified, that you can be used if the original skill isn't actually known. For instance, if you're skilled in clubs and not skilled in maces, you can default to your club value or something similar like that. Some skills also have prerequisites, meaning that you have to have the prerequisite, whether it be another skill, attribute, or advantage, before you can actually use it. Chapter 7 is Cash and Gear, which is basically a big list and descriptions of the various gear that a character can get. This includes weapons and weapons and armor may also have various qualities applied to them. Weapons generally have a damage type and may have adjustments to their damage. This is usually based on the character's basic damage, which is in turn based on their strength. So when a weapon may state, for instance, SW plus 1 cut, that means it does swing damage is based on the character's strength, plus 1, and then it does cutting type damage, which actually matters because injuries of different types actually can do different sorts of damage to different types of effects. Weapons may also have a parry value, which may modify the chance to parry with it, whether it becomes unbalanced while doing so, and then if it's ranged, they may have accuracy mods. Arranged for that ranged weapon, and special notes. Actually, any weapon may have special notes. Armor is treated similarly, functioning as a damage reduction to incoming attacks. Armor may be worn piecemeal, with its DR applying only to that particular body part, and may be layered in certain instances. For instance, wearing chain or a cloth armor under a plate. This section closes up with a brief list of magic items, which can serve as purchasable items or as a guideline to make other more complex magic. The appendix has a few sample characters to demonstrate how to create a character. Now on to the next book, Exploits. This is the one that discusses the various specific rules. It breaks down into an introduction, 6 chapters, rolling the dice, dungeon delving, fighting, bad things, treasure, and then game mastering. There are a collection of tables at the end as well as an example of play. The introduction this time is brief, simply telling which books are used by who. Chapter 1, Rolling the Dice, tells who rolls for what and gives rules for successful rolls, which, it can be skills or other checks. Generally speaking, Dungeon Fantasy uses a 3d6 roll versus a target number. This is used for all sorts of skill tests, contests, sense rolls to see if something is noticed, and so forth. There is a discussion of influence rolls for influencing NPC attitudes, as well as fright checks, which may be triggered by various fear effects. Finally, reaction rolls are used to see what various NPC or monsters' initial reactions are if they aren't already stated in an adventure. Chapter 2 covers dungeon delving, or the basic rules for exploration, but actually starts in town, which may seem odd for a game focused on dungeon crawling, but there has to be a reason for characters to delve into dungeons and a place to prepare for delves. So In Town talks about ways to procure equipment, sometimes on the cheap, earn money, find a particular quest, potentially find additional income, and then dealing with selling loot once the party comes back. There's a surprising number of options for income here besides just selling loot, and a keen adventuring group can monetize quite a bit of the expedition. Some basic talk about getting to the dungeon and some rules for outdoor adventuring follow, but the lion's share of the chapter are rules for the dungeon crawling, as well as mapping, light sources, dealing with doors and scouting, dealing with various physical aspects of dungeon crawling, maneuvering through corridors and going around obstacles, and so forth. There's a section for dealing with traps and hazards, and then various rules on looting beyond just finding gold. Chapter 3, Fighting, is the combat rules section. It covers surprise attacks, maneuvering, and actual attacking. Dungeon Fantasy, like GURPS, has a pretty in-depth combat system. Based on a hex grid, it has rules for various sorts of combat maneuvers, including various ways to attack and defend, and the various movement rules that even take into account cornering and changing direction. Attacks actually are more than just hit or miss. Characters can be stunned by attacks. Attacks do different damage depending on the type of damage and where the attack hits. Yes, even attack locations are determined, so that piecemeal armor thing can come back to bite a character who doesn't wear a helm. There are various defenses as well, from blocking with shields or cloaks, parrying, or straight-up dodging attacks. Damage and injury can actually be more than simply reducing hit points, such as knocking a character backward, inflicting a particular injury, crippling a limb, or so forth. Chapter 4 is just listed as bad things, which are the various fates that can affect characters. It starts with dealing with injuries and how to heal them, the effects of being knocked down, crippled, what happens when a character dies, and how to heal from those wounds. Fatigue is also discussed, which is important, especially for spellcasters, since fatigue is used to cast spells as well as for some other physical feats. Specific types of special damage and effects are covered as well, anything from falling and disease damage to poison and fire. Treasure is the 5th chapter, and honestly it just deals with the value of various things such as precious metals, gems, jewelry, and other luxury items, as well as how to sell them in town. So there are some more magic item qualities described here as well. The last real chapter of the book is Game Mastering, which gives guidance for GMing a dungeon fantasy game. It covers designing dungeons, the various aspects thereof, such as determining walls, locks, obstacles, and so forth. Some talk is given on designing encounters as well as how to actually balance the game in play, making sure that everybody has their role to play. There's some talk about awarding character points as well. Rather than an experience system, Dungeon Fantasy ranks various things that can happen in a game, and then the characters receive character points at the end of a session, which can be saved up to buy more skills, abilities, and advantages. The book closes out with a summary of tables required for the various rules, basically a one-stop shop for all the necessary modifiers that you can find, and then an appendix that has a very brief example of the game in play. The last 2 books of the rules section are shorter than the prior 2 and can be summarized pretty quickly. Spells has 2 main sections. The first chapter covers the rules for spellcasting across the various types of professions that can cast spells. This usually boils down to spending some fatigue and making a skill roll, although some spells may require more power or more casting. There's areas that can heighten or make more difficult various types of spells, and powering spells with power items can be an important part of spellcasting. In fact, it may be critical to a high-end spellcaster. There is talk of ritual casting, and then descriptions of the various classes of spells, specifically the ones that produce standardized effects, like balls or rays or so on. The second chapter is just a list of spells. Now, spells are handled like skills, and advanced spells simply may have a string of simpler spells as prerequisites. Spells are divided into particular schools as well, such as fire spells or illusion spells. The spells book closes out with a handy reference table of each spell's summary of requirements. Monsters, by contrast, have 3 chapters. The first is a summary of monsters' likely actions, tactics, and how to deal with combat situations that are mostly useful for just monsters, like dealing with multi-hex figures. Chapter 2 covers monster-specific advantages and disadvantages, as well as classes, which are just a collection of traits and guidelines for particular groups of monsters. Finally, Chapter 3, the Bestiary, is just that, a bestiary. It includes a description of each monster, their relevant stats, abilities, traits, abbreviated list of skills, and so forth. Monsters in GURPS are generally built with points, the same as player characters, except they're usually not limited to a particular point total, except if they're summoned by spells or created by other magic or effects. The rest of the contents of the box are what's required to run the included adventure I Smell a Rat. This is a very simple introductory adventure, just 24 pages, which covers a 16-room dungeon under a merchant's basement. It has a plot, simple enough, but all in all seems more like a gauntlet designed to show off how to handle various types of combats and other situations, as well as some dungeon exploration in general. The map includes fold-out maps for a second part of the adventure, which actually isn't included in the box set. Instead, that part of the adventure is covered in the Dungeon Fantasy Companion, which is available separately as a separate purchase. So I'll be the first to admit that although I've been aware of and owned some GURPS books in the past, all the way back to the 3rd edition set, honestly haven't played much of it at all until I picked up this box set. And even then, I haven't played as much as I would have liked. That having been said, I'm kind of torn. I really like this system. It's a subset of the overall GURPS 4th edition system designed for ease of use in a particular sort of genre that I really enjoy. This makes it easier to understand and learn than the full GURPS system, at least in my opinion. The combat is complex but not overwhelming and seems to be pretty dynamic for my limited playtime. It's got a certain sort of balance to it that seems to allow both melee and magic-based characters to hold their own without feeling artificially leveraged in. I enjoy some of the nods to realism and how they're handled, with things like weapon reach, certain weapons effectively handling different in terms of parrying and such, stackable armor, and other maneuvers. The advancement system, based on points, is excellent. Compared to my current go-to systems of the D&D variety for dungeon crawling, Dungeon Fantasy tends to start with slightly more powerful characters, kind of limiting the instant doom of low-level character life a little bit, and yet has a flatter advancement curve, rather than quickly propelling characters to demigod status. It makes for what might seem to be a little bit grittier, more dangerous-feeling long-term campaign style, and yet there are certain elements, such as how in-town actions are handled, the importance of basically strip-mining a dungeon, and of course the various explanatory quotes throughout the book that lends it a sort of humor akin to the Munchkin properties. Not quite as far as that one, but just a touch to lighten the feel of things. The point-buy system also allows for character customization without having to worry so much about the tangle of feats and class intrinsic that are found in certain other systems. That's not to say that I don't have some concerns. Combat is at least as complex as any other modern system, and even though the unification of die tests to d6s does tend to speed that up on that end, the tactical options and need to account for facing and maneuvering can slow things down a bit until the group is very used to them. Not terribly slowed down compared to, say, the latest editions of D&D or the like, but slower than certain older systems that might be used for a dungeon bash type of game. Preparing adventures also takes a little bit more effort on the GM's part. The monsters examined in the monster book are a good selection, but we're not talking the hundreds upon hundreds present for certain other games. Yes, you can design your own using the point system, but even loosely designing it by collecting various advantages and disadvantages takes a little bit of time. Not a lot, but more than just picking a monster out of a book. I'm also disappointed to see certain classes of spells are not touched upon in the spells section, or at least not in such a manner as I would like, especially regarding things like summons or animations. Now, the compatibility with GURPS 4th edition means that you can just plug GURPS 4th edition magic directly into the game, which is good because that is a good book, but it does mean going outside the scope of the box set, and thus this review. In terms of the physical product, I like the dice. The battle maps are okay, but they're really only useful for the included adventure. The cardboard tokens do seem durable enough and might be useful for a far more lengthy campaign than just one adventure, although I get the feeling that if you play this enough, you're probably going to want proper minis anyway. They're good enough to get started with, and I can appreciate that. The books, despite being paperback, are surprisingly durable. I didn't have any serious problems even with heavy use of them so far, although edge wear may be a concern going forward. All in all, Dungeon Fantasy may be my favorite RPG that I'm not able to get my groups to play at the moment. It's a very good introduction to GURPS in general, and the fact that you can slot a lot of existing GURPS stuff into it makes it quite expandable. It looks like it could easily sustain a long-term Mega Dungeon style campaign, as it really shines with what it's designed for, which is dungeon crawling. I actually found some of the optional rules within it to be useful for systems other than GURPS. Not as per, say, the rules numerically themselves, but the inspiration behind them, especially regarding monetization of any sort of dungeon crawl. I honestly wish that it just came with a different form factor, because honestly, a Dungeon Fantasy hardback with just the 4 main books of rules combined in it would be an instant buy for me. But I can understand the aim of giving everything you need in one box. Now, I just wish this was a more popular game. I really do. I'd love to see more stuff come out for it going forward. For now, I suppose I'll just have to find ways to get one of my groups to play it and keep an eye out on some of the supplements that are coming out. Anyway, this has been the RPG Crawler with my review of Dungeon Fantasy. As always, I'll put some links to where you can pick this up in the description below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.